It's a lot of my experience. I feel very fortunate to have been in the right place at the right time. Jay undersold the fact that when I told Jay, yeah, we can help you out with the beaver stuff, I got in the truck to go home and I thought, what have I done? I don't know anything about beavers. Because to that point I didn't know Joe Eaton. I didn't know Joe was in our department. I'd only been back at Utah State about 8 months. I'm standing in the hallway one day thinking, boy, what am I going to do? And I walk past this poster and I look up and here's a beaver and I thought, I'll be danged. So fate has led us to a lot of where we're at today in terms of, then I was able to introduce Joe to Jay and so forth. But as I was flying into Reno, I remembered where I kind of got bit by the beaver bug. Ironically, Jeremy, 10 years ago, the last time the meeting was in Reno, ironically, as a grad student, Jeremy invited me to go to dinner. Wendell Gilgert was there. And in the conversations with Wendell, he found out I was a student at Utah State. And he asked me if I knew about the Blacksmith Fork drainage. Of course I did. And then he started talking about the number of beavers that had been trapped out of the Blacksmith Fork drainage back in the day. Apparently Wendell was researching some numbers for a book or something he was writing. And I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was hundreds of thousands of beaver that come out of this drainage. And so the whole way home I just kept thinking, wow, what would that landscape have looked like with hundreds of thousands of beavers in it? And being kind of a grouse and grazing guy, I started thinking of how important mesic habitats are. And so that's kind of where we've culminated to today. So when Jay said, hey, I'm looking for beaver, I thought, man, this is fun. I'd like to jump into this. So literally I did, ended up in the creek at a field tour. So here we are. So I work for Extension. So that means oftentimes my job is to restate the obvious, to make sure we all get it. Jeremy asked me to kind of do a wrap up today. And to be honest, this is a topic I struggled with more than I thought I would. Oh yeah, I can give a 20-minute presentation, not a big deal. It took me more time to put this one together than most, so I hope it's worthwhile. But it caused me to reflect on riparians and what, we've spent the whole day talking about how important riparian areas are. And I can't help but think of these historic photos that we have. Some of these are from Charles Kay's book. So this is on the Tusher Mountains in Utah in 1919. Those are some awesome looking horses there. But we've been really encouraged. Here's this same meadow in 1999. So we've made some dramatic improvements in riparian areas since those early days in the foundation of range management. However, the thing staring us in the face is our work is not done. It's not even close to being done. And so some of this is due to a legacy effect, right? Some of what we're dealing with today is a legacy effect from degraded streams that were degraded generations ago that we're still dealing with. But we're still in this place where we've got to do some work. I think one of the most interesting things I've thought about recently about riparian areas is if you go back in some of the older range textbooks, they actually refer to these things as sacrifice areas. So it's clear that, this one for sure was a sacrifice area, right? But I fear even today we still have some of these sacrifice areas. And so we start thinking about how do we motivate people to change? How do we, of course, working in Extension, I think of this a lot. And I was listening to a podcast the other day about this topic. And they had a really interesting talk. I won't get into the study because it was about college students and STDs, and I don't really want to bring that out into the open here today. It's a long ways from what we really want to talk about. But they talked about the stick and the carrot. And they talked about that when we motivate people with fear, so in riparian, when we start thinking about range management, riparian, when we think about how do we motivate these people, and I'm guilty, right? Every time I talk about monitoring, I'm telling them the devil's coming for them if they don't start measuring their grass. So, we talk about fear of loss of habitat, loss of forage, loss of their permit, regulations. These regulations are coming. They're coming for you. You've got to fix this. And we talk about lawsuits, right? John Griggs showed the picture of John Marvel, right? So we've all stood up and said, Western Watersheds is coming for you if you don't do these things. Well, these studies found that fear was a very inadequate motivator. So there was a real short-term bump with fear, meaning you could really get people excited to go home and do something. But as soon as they were no longer and had an immediate fear from being beat with that stick, then the motivation dissipates very quickly. So as I started thinking about my monitoring programs, I started to feel pretty sheepish, right? So maybe I haven't approached this the right way, and I still haven't solved monitoring's problems. So I started thinking about this riparian situation. How do we really motivate people to change? Because this is great today. We've all enjoyed it. A lot of the people in the room are professionals, and we're all going to go home and we're going to try to figure out how to get people to do what we've talked about. The people that need to hear this are not necessarily the people in the room right now. So, like a lot of our talks have talked about, which have been really, really good, we've talked about improved hydrological function, we've talked about improved riparian condition, we've talked about wildlife habitat for toads and sage grouse and everything else. But what are we really trying to sell? How do we really reach those producers? How do we really reach a landowner? In Utah, because of settlement patterns, most of our critical riparian habitat is not in federal hands. It's in private hands because that's where people settled, is where you could actually make a living because there was actually some water there to make things grow. So Mark Brunson and Chris Hulvey had a graduate student that had just conducted a survey. Some of that data was presented by Mark in an earlier session. But the one that stood out to me, they asked ranchers what they were managing for, which ecosystem services they were managing for. Now this should surprise nobody in the room, right? It should surprise nobody. What does a producer manage for? So 98%, Mark's sitting right here, so hopefully I get the numbers right and everything right. If not, he can correct me. 98% identified forage as an ecosystem service that they managed for. That doesn't mean there weren't other ecosystem services that were associated with that, but this drives home the point that these producers need to manage for to remain economically feasible and viable forage production. So this leads me to the project that I'm currently involved in. So I'm a Johnny-come-lately to the beaver thing, right? Joe, a lot of these others have been doing this for a long time. But one of the unique little niches that I found is we haven't really started talking about what this means to a livestock producer in terms of forage and forage quality. So here's the study area, which Joe's talked about, Jay's talked about. So we've identified these areas, we've put some BDAs in, and so we're now in the process of monitoring that, which, as you all know, it takes more than a year or two to start getting something that means something. So last year we collected our baseline data. I'm not going to bore you with data. I think you've seen enough data today. You know, here's some examples of those BDAs. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit to drive this point home a little bit more thoroughly. So, being that I spent some time in Oklahoma, I can't avoid not talking about fire once in a while. So the patch burn grazing dynamic. Who's heard of patch burn grazing? Okay, so we've got a part of the room that has, and this relates to beavers. Just give me a minute. So here's a study that Brady Allred did, the really smart guy that was before me moderating the session. This was in Oklahoma. I knew Brady when he was there. This was a study looking at bison. Suffice it to say, those darker reds show where the bison are distributed on the landscape. The lighter colors show where they're not. Brady showed that these bison were basically moving across the landscape based upon where those fires were. So fire was moving animals across the landscape. Secondarily, says bison prefer recently burned areas. Probabilities change as fire moves around the landscape. So fire is the driving force moving animals. Of course, as a good ecologist, you have to wonder what mechanism is driving that. So here is the crude protein content. So guess what happens to crude protein content when you burn a patch? Does it go up or down? It goes up significantly. So they were basically creating these resource or nutrient dense patches on a landscape that the bison were now flowing to. So think of it as like a nutrient gradient. They're flowing from low quality habitat or low quality forage to an area of high quality forage. So here's another project that Brady Allred also helped with. He did the resource selection function on this. This is from northern Utah. So this shows cattle distribution across the landscape. Anybody guess where the cattle flow to? Okay. These aren't strings of alfalfa, right? Pretty close. These are all riparian areas. So what are the cattle flowing to, especially later in the summer? They're flowing to these riparian areas. There's some great work that I found out of Oregon. This is showing the amount of time cattle spent in riparian areas. Suffice it to say, the pattern holds especially late in the summer. Why late in the summer? Well, as our uplands dry up, what happens to crude protein content? Crude protein content goes down. Where are you going to find high enough crude protein content on the landscape? So, to kind of drive this home, cattle require 6 to 10% crude protein content in their forage in order to sustain themselves, especially if you want to make any money when you're done. So as these uplands dry out, they kind of become a low nutrient site, or think of this as the patch burn grazing even. So when an animal finds itself in that situation, it's got two choices. It can move to those patches of high nutrients, or they can change what they eat and try to find additional forage that has that higher protein content. The scary part with this is sometimes they start eating stuff we don't want them to, and that's where we get plant poisonings. And so this helps to kind of visualize what's happening on our landscapes as the season progresses. Our animals are attracted to these riparian areas because the protein content's higher. So these areas are not just areas to hang out. These areas become really critical, not from just a water standpoint. So often our solution is we'll just put another trough out, but the trough really doesn't help us to solve the protein bottleneck late in the season in the Great Basin. So beavers, right? It's about damn time. So here's an example. We've already talked about Bridge Creek, but to kind of drive home what I'm trying to kind of lead you to, so here's an area. They changed the grazing. We see some improvements in riparian condition. Are we really seeing a lot of extra green vegetation in this situation? No. Magic happens. The beavers show up. Now how much green vegetation have we got in those bottoms? So another example. I found this one driving in the field this summer. I'm coming home from doing some field sampling with one of our crews. This is a really old beaver dam. I have no idea how long it's been there, but it illustrated my point. So I stopped and took a couple of photos. You can see the old dam. I want you to note how deep that ravine is. So my guess at looking at this ravine, at one point in time, it had been fairly downcut and heavily eroded. You know, we're talking about 8+ feet right there. I want you to look at this completely grassed-in meadow as we've caught that sediment. And which would you rather have, right? Especially in terms of, I want you to think like a producer now, forage production, forage quality. So here's another one just downstream. Notice that this one's completely vegetated. It's completely grassed in. The dam's no longer even really visible. You can't see the log sticking out. But again, this drives home the point of how valuable these small patches can become. Cows can actually forage and do quite well on some pretty low quality forage if they can supplement their forage with some high quality forage to balance out their nutritional needs. So when we go home and try to sell this, when we really talk about how we can encourage people to do more of this, I'm going to encourage you to think about forage production. Often when we've thought about riparians, most of it's been about getting animals off the stream, which I'm not sitting here suggesting we should fence them in. We've had some talks about riparian grazing, and that's a key component to all of this. So all of this is couched with there has to be proper grazing management. But in terms of trying to bring producers along and encourage them to adopt these practices, I think this is the tact that we really need to start thinking about, is actually targeting things that matter to them. So you hear Jay talk about the cutthroat trout. Well, no offense, but Jay's not normal entirely. Jay's a forward, I've known Jay for a long time, and Jay's a forward-thinking individual. So it's really good to have Jay Tanners and John Griggs in a room. But we're hoping to use those people to drag along a whole other group that's a little bit skeptical of all of this. And so I guess what kind of my wrap-up point here is we think about how do we go home and sell this, whether we work for NRCS or the agencies or Extension, is to think about the things that really matter to those people that we're asking to implement them. The beauty of this collaboration and this type of holistic management is it intends to benefit more than just the producer or just the frog people or just the fish people. It can fit all of those people. So again, the whole point is just a wrap-up. Instead of thinking about how do we conserve those critical riparian areas that we have, we should be thinking about how do we expand those critical riparian areas that we have. As we add the beaver back and adjust our grazing management to be appropriate, we're going to see more of this on this landscape. Again, this is July, right? So you notice how green this is. You notice how dry this is, right? This drives home the point of creating more of these high-quality patches. So going back to our original Grouse Creek example, I want you to visualize in your mind, even for those of you that have not been here, what happens if you increase the extent of your riparian habitat by 50% along those stream channels across the landscape like that. Are we going to be as worried about these limited resources that we have in very short areas? This will actually help spread out our use, lighter use over greater areas. So this is the point that I hope we all go home thinking about, is rather than thinking about how do we conserve these little things we've got left, let's think about expanding those into greater opportunities. It's interesting, I think I've got time for a real quick side story. When I started working for Terry Mesmer, this is the area I did my sage grouse work in as a PhD student. I worked for the Poisonous Plant Research Lab. At the time, Lynn James was the research leader. He grew up out here. His family settled on the other side of the hill from Jay. When he found that I was leaving the lab and moving out there, he became quite enamored with me. Finally learned my name, that I actually worked there. But he started telling me all these stories about when his family first settled, there were all these mesic bottoms in the bottoms of each of these draws and ravines. And of course, you write it off as that's a great antidote, la la la. But the more time I spent on the ground in Box Elder County, I recognized that it was true and that there were. And then again, you try to visualize what that landscape would have looked like with this incredible extent of wet meadow complexes across the landscape. So with that, if I have time, I'll take a couple of questions.